Sounds good, John. First up on our list, Istio has turned 6 years old this week, which is pretty exciting. I don't think we're having any official party for it this time around, but I know we've done a few events in the past, like the 5-year party at KubeCon Europe. So pretty cool to look back on how far we've come over the last 6 years and imagine where we might go over the next 6. Looks like our first item of work is workload entry addresses from Steve Landau. Steve, are you here?
Yeah.
That is a really unhelpful way to open that document. Hold on a sec. There we go.
So the short version of this proposal is we want a way to write some stuff into a local cluster so that it can find endpoints from other clusters or other networks without reading its the remote API server. So we can technically do this today by just writing a workload entry with the gateway's address, but that's kind of circumventing everything built into Istio around understanding like what is multi-network and what things are on other networks. I don't really know if we have too many policies that actually look directly at the network field, but if we did, they would not be affected at all. And so the core of the proposal is pretty much that once we send everything to the data plane, we get rid of any IP, like actual pod IP for an individual like cross-network endpoint. And so I'm saying that we maybe shouldn't even need to post that IP at all. And that's pretty much it. Like really all we need to know is that there are some workloads that have a given label in that other network. Costin?
Yeah, you mentioned you don't want to watch the other cluster, but you do need to watch it, first of all, because you need to get the secure naming. I put a comment there, because you don't know the service identities and we dynamically guess what service accounts are associated. And second, to get the gateways, no? So
not the gateways, because the gateways, you could just write them to the mesh config, or you could just write your own service object with the external IP.
Why would you do that instead of using the workload entry, which is kind of, the IP address of those workloads is actually that gateway IP, and you have, I know how we are doing things. We either watch the remote cluster to get the gateways, or yes, you can create some put some labels, put something in mesh config, but mesh config is not really a CRD, and it's far less, has a number of implications. You have to reinstall to do helm install again. It's a global. There are all kind of problems with.
Yeah, I have a second proposal. It's like the next item on the agenda for basically using like a gateway object and as the thing that you write instead of like a service or mesh config. Just talking about like what exists today that you could do this with. Because yeah, the reason I don't really think we want to write the gateway IP everywhere is number one, like that's going to have to be updated on like every single workload entry object. And number two, like we don't have like everything works today with this mechanism. Like we don't have to change much code at all to make this proposal work. To figure out that, oh, we actually want to use the address as a gateway address is a little different, because right now the control plane, if it sees the network field set, it's just going to throw away the endpoint address, and then it's going to like look internally for network gateways, which this ignores. So you'd have to like, you wouldn't really have any indication that this workload entry is on another network anymore. This would just be like, we're going to treat the whole gateway as that workload. Second, if I have, workload A and workload B, and they're both part of different services, and they have that same address and maybe the same ports and the same network, I'm pretty sure that when we send that down to ztunnel, it messes with the keying a bit. I know that we added a UID and stuff to differentiate, but we are sending a bunch of things that all have the same IP that are actually different things.
Yeah, no, I don't mind making it optional. My point is that if we want to stop watching, I don't think relying on mesh config is a solution. If we have a different register, then maybe it's okay. But okay. And don't forget secure naming, because that's really a huge problem in general, not only for this particular proposal, but we cannot stop watching unless we have an alternative.
I haven't thought about that really at all.
Doesn't the workload entry have the service account and that's handled to secure naming?
Is that enough? Like, is that trust? Like, we can trust that?
That's one way, but I think we are still watching the remote pods and merge them. So it's not.
Well,
I don't know
for
if
a
people are
VM, I
setting-
guess this is the same as like treating it like an external VM on another network.
Yeah, I know. If you put service account, but if you can put service account foo, but today the pods in the other cluster may have 5 different service accounts. They may be created dynamic. So version 1 has foo-v1. Then you do deploy a new version. You remember how we deploy Istio WG, where we create a service account for each revision.
Yeah, but they're not watching the remote cluster. They have something watching the remote cluster and then turning those pods into workload entries. It's just each Istio D doesn't watch the other clusters, right? So they can still find all the service accounts on the other cluster. So it's like the MCS endpoint slice syncing, but done differently.
So there is a different controller that watches the pods. Keep in mind, service account field here is singular. You don't have multiple.
I
Anyway,
imagine
keep in
you
mind
create
that
one
you could have
workload entry
multiple
per
workload
service
entries.
account and then set the weight based on how many pods or something.
Complicated. Okay.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. It's pretty small. And I think the only thing that would really have to be changed is probably like some validation code. One thing I did want to ask is like, should we make it so that you can only have the address be empty if the network is set?
Yeah, I think we should do that, and probably also always warn if address is unset. You can warn not do an error.
Okay.
If you're doing this in a controller, it won't even look at the warning, so it doesn't matter. If you're a user, you probably messed up if you don't set the address. So I think a warning will be helpful.
Could we just warn when the network, when you don't have the network?
Oh, we should fail if you don't have a network, because that's just invalid, right?
Okay, so what's the value to warn the user when you are on different network? Maybe I missed that, because we no longer require that, right?
Just so you don't make a mistake, right? I mean, this is very advanced use case, and you can easily just forget to put a field in. Now you're wondering why your workload entry does nothing. Like this
I
only
see.
works in a very, very specific topology that's not even documented on Istio, or probably used beyond one deployment, right?
Yeah, and even if the network's set, like it could be the local network, and like the whole concept of like the local network is fuzzy. So you might have the network set, but you still actually do want to hit the IP.
Yeah. So if we take a step back here, we kind of went through this pattern from the beginning of the project almost every time, where we hack something, forgetting the fundamental design, and then it works, and that perpetuates forever. If I remember correctly, workload entry, we had before service entry where we put endpoints, and workload entry was intended to be a representation of a single workload like pod. Pod and workload entry would be kind of the same. Now we are saying that workload entry is a group of entries, and we are changing the fundamental semantic. I mean, I don't care about removing the address. It's fine to remove address, but my concern here is that we take an API that had a very clear semantic, and we are hacking it into completely different things that will probably lead to other similar confusion for the user. Can we find a solution for this problem where Istio is just looking at service entry, or some other, whatever gateway you want to say, you can indicate that it's associated with some workload or something that doesn't alter this API at fundamental level, making a workload entry to represent multiple entries, really. I mean, it's no longer a workload entry if there are multiple entries behind them, and it's whatever expectation we had, that kind of.
Yeah, I see your point. I don't really have a better suggestion. I mean, like workload group seems super wrong, and service entry seems super wrong, and I don't think we should be creating a new CR for this.
Maybe we should create, I mean, if we want to represent, I mean, they have replica sets, they have daemon sets, they have deployments, they have 5 different ways to represent works, but they didn't hack pod to say a pod without IP is a replica set or a service or whatever. It's very problematic in a lot of Istio APIs, but do we really need? I mean, can service entry have this information? Because really you are representing a service running in the remote cluster. Can we create a service entry that?
Not exactly, because like what if we had if I have a service and I have some local pods and some remote pods and I want a load balance between them and I want them to be selected.
You can have multiple service entries for the same service. You can create, one service entry for each remote cluster, put the network, put, the list of service accounts, because then when you have a list of pods, it makes sense to have multiple service accounts. It was meant to represent a group. I mean, the service entry is meant to represent a group of workloads. That's why it has multiple service accounts there.
Yeah, would it be sufficient to just have the service entry have endpoints, but also have a workload selector and allow both of those and merge them?
That seems very reasonable. Or have two service entries and merge them, because that's the same thing effectively. And much cleaner.
Wouldn't that break our ability to like use a Kubernetes service that does cross network?
I think we merge service and service entry, and it's something we can fix. I mean,
Okay.
I would rather, fix a bit more code than fundamentally change an API that is, it hurts me to, to think of a workload entry that is suddenly becoming a service entry because it represents multiple workloads.
Do we have something to indicate network there yet? Because I'm pretty sure that would I guess we could use the label yet again, but
We have plenty of options. I mean, if we are changing the CR semantics like you are proposing here to make address optional, we can also add stuff or fix service entry or improve it, or, make it one first class. I think there are plenty of options, even simple on service entry.
so I guess how do we know that a service entry says like, hey, you know what, just like there are some number of endpoints behind gateways for some network, like we would need to still like have a place to put weight and a place to put that network, which would be on the endpoints field. And then so like
The
Is it the
workload
work-
entry spec is a field, a
Right.
repeated field in service entry, right?
So
anything
you're saying
we're
that
putting
this
here-
new rule only applies to a workload entry inside of a service entry?
That works too. Well, it works. It's a bit. I would rather add the fields that you say you need in service entry, because they kind of make sense. I mean, if you want the service entry to be associated to a network, that's fine. But yeah, that's a workaround. At least it doesn't break the semantics of workload entry CRD.
Okay, I guess I'm a little bit cautious on changing things when a lot of users already know how to use workload entry and they are familiar with this. They are using it to onboarding VM, onboarding services, outside of the cluster. So I'm not sure what benefit would we gain by merging workload entry to service entry at this stage.
So they are using workload entry to represent one VM, and the semantic of workload entry is workload and one workload entry. It's not a group of workloads. And this change, what is proposing, is actually to change the semantic of workload entries that people are familiar with and they typically understand to represent one workload into becoming a group of workloads. And I think that users will be confused, and it will lead to more problems down the road than just representing a group of workloads with an object that was intended to represent a group of workloads, which is service entry.
But today you can indicate weights, which would indicate more than one workload, right? Like workload entry today, you can specify weights 3, and we even do load balance properly based on the weights.
Weight is associated with the workload. And workload may be on a big VM, and then it can have weight 5. or it can be a very small VM and weight is 0.5 or 1 or whatever. So it's a weight of that particular endpoint in the set of endpoints. It's not the, I mean, we use that as a hack, yes, but it's not meant to be a group of workloads hidden behind one.
So I guess another thing that you can't do with this is like, if I have some pod, now I have to go, if I have some pod in the remote cluster, now I have to go write it to multiple service entries in the local cluster if it's being used by multiple services, or I have to like account for its weight or whatever. Like add the empty address entry.
That's a very common weights and load reporting service and all this stuff. It's a complicated topic and probably not. We don't need to mix it in this because we have ways to represent weights in service entry as well. And but my point is weight in workload entry, as far as I know, it was meant to represent the weight of that particular workload entry.
I think it definitely makes whatever controller trickier to do it on service entry.
Yeah, so custom, there's still this requirement, right, that you want to model a workload entry that exists, right? I mean, it's there are workloads, but you have limited information about it because of the split horizon problem.
Yeah, that's I mean, representing a group of workloads.
Right, but
is
service entry doesn't
valuable.
represent a group of workloads, right? Service entry represents an addressable service. That's something else, right? That's a consumer side view as opposed to, right, an atom of workload that can be composed into multiple services, right? The problem Stephen just described.
Well, it represents a bag of services of workloads that may be either individually be represented there because it has a list of workloads that can be represented there, or a label selector. I mean, it's generally a bag. It's a set of workloads in service entry. So both of, I mean, it's a plural. It's like deployment, like replica set, like if you remember, Sven, when workload entry was introduced, the idea was to mirror what Kubernetes is doing. So we have the plurals, I mean, daemon set, replica set, whatever in Kubernetes, that is service entry. And then workload entry was created as equivalent of a pod. And I think that's intuitive, it's logical, it's reflected in the structure of the entry. I mean, there is one service account. I would rather abuse service entry, which is a bag, than to hack workload entry, which is a singular.
I wouldn't say service entry was used to represent daemon set or deployment.
A group, I mean, a plural.
No, but it's not. It was meant to represent service, right? It was just meant to deal with the ways of binding endpoints to a service that weren't supported in Kubernetes.
Yes, to represent the grouping of endpoints that is addressable.
Right, endpoints, right? Not
Endpoints, yes. Actually, yeah, that's true. Endpoints and workloads, that's a very good distinction. In this case, is there a distinction between, yeah, we don't have the IP address, so it's kind of a third way, which is kind of.
Right, but we would still know identity, right? Like other attributes of the workload.
Yeah, no. I'm not saying. I mean, again, it's more principled than practically. It's not a big deal to remove to make address optional, but I don't know if it's the proper thing to do. And then we have the labels because the workload entry has labels, and you can have kind of different labels on each for NDS purpose. I don't know. Just feels wrong. That's my concern. But for the record, I have absolutely no problem to make address optional. Just it's completely relevant. The interesting thing is if it's a good thing or not a good thing to do to make us workload entry represent multiple.
I mean, we don't have to like recommend it right away. And right now, the fact is like if I just put any address in there, like it doesn't matter what I put as long as I have that network field and there's a gateway for that network. We're just going to ignore it. And I think it would be nice to actually handle that properly in SDOD rather than have some areas of the code that are like, oh, there's an address here. I'm going to use that as like a key in some map, which I think there's one thing that does it with auto registration, which might not be relevant to this, but I could absolutely see other areas of the code doing this.
Code is clearly, I mean, again, having a workload entry where we don't know the address is very legitimate, which can be reached by other things. It's the practice of using a workload entry to represent multiple things that is problematic. And again, in terms of recommended best practice, safe, kind of, or you are doing a hack and that's okay. I mean, it's not, as long as you understand that it's a hack and it's not some best practice, then whatever, we do a lot of other hacks in Istio.
Yeah, I mean, because the actual destination is opaque, right? You don't know if there's one or two or many, right? In reality. So I don't know if I'd call it a hack, right? What you're really saying is we just don't have visibility. And it's up to the implementer to decide if they create like n workload entries for n VMs or pods on another network, or they create one. Because it's still up to the bridging gateway to figure out how to get the traffic to them. It becomes more relevant if you have stateful sets.
Exactly, and also the proper way would be the controller to create one workload entry for each workload, so pod or VM, like for consistency, even if it's not used, and then have the actual labels of that particular workload with the pod ID and whatever. So a proper controller would mirror the pods
right,
to get
but the downside of that is scale, right? Like
of course,
that has scale.
Of course, but conceptually, I mean, from workload entry, semantics. I mean, that's what you do for VMs, and that's what we do for same network.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe we should define another concept for kind of cross network, or I mean, it's not so hard to add another.
Well, I don't want to introduce another API if we can avoid it.
I agree.
So
that's why I prefer to use the service entry. I mean, if we make some changes to make them in the service entry where.
Yeah, but right, I think that's like if you have to choose between the two, I would choose workload entry over service entry today, because it's still modeling a workload or group of workloads as opposed to modeling a consumable service and its bound endpoints, which are right. Those are. One is closer than the other.
If it wasn't for the service account field, which is singular, and the group will probably have multiple service accounts, maybe I would agree with you. And also the name of the structure, which is workload entry, not entries, or. But with proper revision-based upgrade, you will have like in Istio, you will have each version of the deployment have a different service account with different RBACs. So you will almost guaranteed have multiple service accounts for that set of workloads.
That's pretty unusual, actually, Custom. Right? That's not common practice.
I think if you use Helm and if you use a service account, since Helm cannot share an object, I think it's pretty common practice for any user of Helm, which are the majority of our users. That's why we have separate service account for each STOD revision, because again, it was very difficult to do otherwise.
Yeah, that may be more like a bug of Helm than a desirable outcome for anybody.
Reality, it's reality.
Okay.
So we're halfway through the hour, but Stephen, you also are the other item on the agenda. So do we need to continue moving towards consensus here, or should we look to the next agenda item?
It sounds like even though Costin's dissenting, he's agreeing, so we can probably move on, right? Like you're fine with the address being empty, but you don't want to go around recommending it.
Yeah, I don't mind.
Okay.
All right. Here is our next item.
The first half of it is pretty much just explaining current state, which for the most part, I think people might know is that like we discover the gateways, like Caution was saying, by either writing the mesh networks or reading the remote cluster's services. And the way we deploy it is with like a bash script that generates an Istio operator YAML that we pipe to Istio Cuddle. And that's also kind of ugly. So it's already possible today to deploy the east-west gateway and have it fully functioning using Gateway API. And so what I was kind of proposing here is that we at least document that and kind of highlight it and maybe recommend it. I think it's just a lot prettier and easier to manage than having like a second Istio operator and like a bunch of deployments and stuff that you generate that are difficult to change after the fact. Then the second thing I wanted to propose is that we actually, instead of reading service, when we can, we would read the actual gateway object. And the main reason for that is that we have a little bit more control on like manually creating gateway objects than we do with service. So same way as like we would create a workload entry in that last proposal to say there's some workloads in another network, you could theoretically today create a service manually in the local cluster to describe the gateway in another cluster. But it's slightly more limited because you can only write an IP, which for like AWS, one of the biggest cloud providers, they generally don't use IPs as their external address. They use a host name, and that means you have to write to the status field, which is a lot trickier.
Why are we writing to status? Isn't it you create the service and AWS assigns you the
So this is
here?
If you want to create the service in the local cluster so you don't have to watch the remote cluster.
Can you do that? You create a real load balancer service and you say it's this IP address that's already used by another cluster and that works?
You can create a service that's like headless or whatever, and you can write to spec.external IPs, but you can't write to the status, which is why I'm proposing that we use gateway.
So you want to make a gateway in cluster A that represents something else.
Yeah, it would represent the gateway in cluster B that actually is deployed.
So
Just like I'm trying to find another way to mirror addresses to another cluster, and this felt somewhat appropriate.
So to be clear, you are creating fake gateways basically that are not actually going to create a deployment. It's not going to be, instantiated, actuated by the controller.
Yeah, so that
But
does
it be ignored, but it's a representation of a real gateway that exists and was created through other means.
Yeah, and so that whole like ignoring deployment part is kind of awkward according to the spec, but we happen to do it already for host name address.
Well, let's cover that part first. That's the easiest of skipping to the deployment and service creation. I put on there's a PR of adding a first class way to do this in the API.
Okay.
So that's an easy one.
Should it be a different class maybe?
Like a remote east-west?
Yeah.
Because we have a class for waypoint, we have a class for gateways. Kubernetes JK has class for internal gateways and public gateways and global gateways and whatever. So that would be the easiest way to indicate that it's and easier to watch for.
Yeah, I like that. A different class name.
For the record, I love the idea, and I think it's an excellent idea to skip watching the remote cluster and have a proper gateway instead of hacking service. So big plus one.
Where do we put the address, Stephen?
Right now or in this proposal?
In this. But I actually don't see an IP address in here.
So this the example over there was actually for deploying it.
Okay.
Yeah.
I think in
As
listener,
opposed to declaring it.
Isn't John? Maybe you know better. I think that it was first class in listener or some other field because it was for use case that.
Yeah, there's both one in spec and in status. So yeah, I guess you'd probably put in both. I think
probably spec is the right place here because it's something that a user is creating.
Yes, I think that is the right place. But then if Istio is not the control, something has to, like for the spec, you have to copy it into status and say a bunch of other things like it's ready and programmed and whatever.
Yeah.
But I think that's something that Is that something Istio would do, or the person creating this gateway would do?
I mean, if we want to be strict and follow the rules, it will be, Istio will populate it, but it's probably overkill. I mean, especially since those will be created probably by controllers. So
Yeah, I mean, we don't actually know anything about it, so it's hard to say whether it's programmed or not, right?
If we don't want to use the status, then aren't we better off using a service to represent this? Wasn't that the key reason for gateway?
No. It will be definitely in the spec. I mean, the spec part definitely has the address. Normally, status is also required to reflect. Basically, it's a copy. So question is the user is copying into places, or we have a controller that's copying from spec to status?
The user is more or less not capable of copying that.
Then we should copy.
You cannot set status. If you use kubectl apply, it ignores the status field. But my question is a little bit bigger. Stephen, you mentioned that one way to do this is with a service with external IP. I think I heard you say that gateway is preferable because we can set the status on.
Sorry, no. The reason gateway is preferable is that with service you can only set external IP and you can't set a host name there, and we need to be able to set host names.
I see. Okay, thank you. That helps.
On service, you can only set host names in the status.
So the option would be to put a host name in an annotation
On the
in
service?
service. Yeah.
Yeah, that would work.
So we'll need a new gateway class, I assume, to represent these gateways that aren't gateways, or at least aren't.
No, they are real gateways, just remote gateways, and it can be used
Well,
with other actuated gateways like
If
load
we use
balancer.
our existing gateway class, Costin, we will schedule an Envoy instance to
No,
run.
different class, Mitch.
Right. So I guess the question here is, what is implicit from the class and what do we actually have to put into the API? Right, like in terms of declaring ports and things like that, or are they mostly inferred from the class if we use class? Right, how verbose do people have to be when they specify these things for the typical case?
I would say that if you is it invalid to, am I muted? No, I'm not. Is it invalid to create a gateway with no ports?
We should put
Or with no listeners?
at least the
It's
H-bone
not.
port should be there. I mean, because it has a port, either the H-bone or the pass-through.
But the port's well known, Costin.
It's well known, but the spec is not.
Right, so-
Well,
Right,
first thing I was going to say is if we have 0 ports, do we just assume that we have the TLS SNI and H-bone?
For
Yes,
now,
I think we would. Yes. So it's because it's either we have a default and then you can override it, right? And then we have to describe what the override means, or we make you declare everything, which gets very verbose, right, and pretty repetitive, and probably is going to annoy people.
Or we'll have a controller's automations that will create this in each cluster, because in the end, if you have 10 clusters, you're not going to do it by hand, probably. You have a script or something. So I don't think the reason I'm actually insisting on this is because in some topologies, you may have a single gateway that is both ingress gateway and east-west gateway, and use a different port. I mean, you have the SNI port for, cross east-west, and you have the you don't have to create two separate gateway objects for.
No, but you could just, when you have a port that is not like the standard 15443, you could write a port named TLS and that would overwrite it. But there's the case if we have gateways that don't support H-bone yet, how do you tell them that? We don't want to assume H-bone exists.
Yeah, that's why you make the port explicit, and then you know if this gateway supports H-bone or supports SNI pass-through or supports some other future, or it has explicit entries or.
So what would it mean to bind a route to a gateway that was remote?
Egress policies.
That's not how we do that, Costin.
No. I'm saying semantically that will be, but I don't think we should allow that in this situation, probably.
Right. So this is not an egress gateway. Right. This is an east-west gateway in a remote cluster. Right. It's basically an ingress gateway that we're pointing at.
All gateways
So
are
we
ingress
can't-
and egress.
No,
really,
but we can't. But it means nothing to bind a route to it because we're not a controller for it. Right. We can't program anything on it. All we're doing is using this to declare that it's there and it has these capabilities.
Actually, that's an interesting point, Louis. Do we want to not control anything, or in future, not now? I mean, I'm not trying to expand this, but do we want to provide fine-grained control over which services are exported? Like, because sometimes you don't want absolutely everything to be automatically exported everywhere.
Right, but that would be more like an egress gateway, right?
Exactly.
Which you would control and have a controller for and do all those things.
And
That
bind
egress
routes.
gateway, that egress gateway may talk to an ingress gateway on the other side, but those are two distinct units of infrastructure, right? So I don't think we can't collapse them right into one resource and then like do all that stuff. Like that would be extremely confusing.
No, I agree. But practically speaking, we should, start with no routes bound to this gateway, but we should think about use cases where we may need to do.
Right. Yeah, this is why I'm worried about the API being a little like the service is probably actually a better logical fit. Right, because it's really just discovery that we're doing.
Or you can think of gateway as an extension of service that has those additional fields and, proper
Right, but
listening.
Right, but it's all the other features of the Gateway API that are likely to, like, you can't bind routes to this.
That's legitimate. I mean, even if you don't say allow routes, you cannot bind even for regular gateways. It's not.
Oh, yeah, no. I mean, we can still do it. I just want to be like cognizant of the risks of. If we could.
It presents a weird break in functionality, right? Like our existing gateways, our waypoints, all of these are fully Gamma compliant. You can bind routes to either gateways or to services. Then all of a sudden we have this one thing that behaves differently. Now, the fact that we're binding routes to services using Gamma might make service equally unpleasant. So maybe that's a non-issue.
Those are both producer-side artifacts, right? They're both controlled in the same domain.
Yeah.
That's not the case here.
I don't think the spec requires that you can bind routes to the gateway.
Yeah, no, it doesn't.
It's a policy. I mean, the admin may choose that whoever can bind or what routes can be bound to this gateway. Allowed routes is basically the field you probably should remove from that example.
Yes. Well, I think there Stephen was showing the example of creating on the other side, not the actual declaration. Stephen, do you have an example of the declaration in the book?
No, but I mean, pretty much just copy this. Let's say that these are optional, and then you would just add an address.
And remove allow routes.
I guess, yeah.
Yeah.
At least for discovery purpose, keeping the port, I think it's important because when you have both HBON and TLS, I think it will be important to have a way to know. And
it's also
Yeah, I
required
mean,
in the spec, so we need something.
Yeah.
And it's better than having the label or whatever hack we are using to auto detect.
Yeah, I would agree with that.
One warning about this is I was looking at the code and it looks like we decide to use the auto pass-through mode if it's on port 15443, which works great if you're using that port, but you have to use that port. So don't
we look at the special annotation as well?
Didn't look like we do.
I was double checking this code the other day and I saw that you checked the gateway port annotation.
The least we use annotations, the better it is.
I was going to say is like the name of the port should take precedence, like the port names TLS.
Oh,
replace
you're
it.
right. You can set the gateway port explicitly. Okay, yeah, I suppose you can.
Stephen, if I can make
I think we should
another
change
request.
that for service as well, like just for the existing state, regardless of this proposal, we should make it so that the name of the port is what decides the number.
So Stephen, one thing I would request is if we introduce this concept, and probably we should make it the default recommended at some point, it should not override or whatever. It should be the way you declare gateway. So if once you have a gateway declared, we ignore all annotation, ignore all the other crap that we are doing, and this is a clear indication from the user that they want to use, the explicit API, not the previous logic.
Yeah, so I guess there are questions like about partial upgrade scenarios, Custon, right? Right, so if I have Istio D watching other clusters and other networks, right, it's kind of automatically doing this, but it's not writing back gateway resources.
After a migration period, I mean, or whatever.
Also, I think what we'd want to use is the status field to indicate, like, let's say we start doing that, we actually have Istio D start writing these things, right? So that then we can transition to explicit. Then you need to know who wrote it to understand whether they were trying to do manual or whether they were trying to do automated.
In few versions, at some point, we should have a path where we have one canonical way to do things instead of having 5, which is also what we discussed in Safe Istio and some other cases where, because we have too many ways and it's getting hard to manage.
Okay. Yeah, overall, I like it. I think it makes sense. Yeah, I think we just need to think a little bit about the upgrade, and I don't think that prevents us from starting to iterate on it.
Any other comments? Seems most people are good with this. All right, I see thumbs up from Costin. I need to record that.
Yeah, so I think directionally approved, needs some refinement, but it's not blocked, right?
Yeah, no, I was actually thinking about the same thing, and I'm very happy with this proposal. It's the right thing to do with the mess we have.
Do we want to keep calling? We have to come up with some names. Are we happy? Well, it's a little bike sheddy, but we keep calling
You mean
things
for the
east west
class?
as opposed to maybe transit, which seems to be a term people are more familiar with. But I digress.
Well, the only last thing on the agenda here is that we have officially entered the public comment period for Istio's graduation at the CNCF. You can follow the comments there or make your own if you choose to do so. That is one of the final steps before the TOC will vote on whether or not to approve our graduation. So it's a great milestone. It's pretty cool that it coincides with the anniversary of the project, and look forward to seeing how that develops.
Yay. Just a note, don't actually comment. It's more, the comments are more for
Yes.
saying don't graduate rather than saying it should graduate.
Okay,
You can
so
comment on the
that's my
voting one that
question.
happens after the 30th.
Okay, so we don't
Yeah,
want
look-
anybody to comment. That's okay.
Yeah, let the CNCF TOC do their thing, and if they have questions, we answer them.
Sorry about that. I guess public service announcement. Don't click that link. Don't do it.
Like, go read it. But yes, just don't distract from the process.
All right. Anything else? Any last minute additions? And I'll see everybody in 10 minutes.
Everyone, see you.
See you.
Thanks.